Okay. Good. All right. Welcome to the introduction session for A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul. I'm Shankar. I conduct these sessions, I guess, but it's more of a combined effort anyway. So today we'll just have a brief update on what this group does, Classically Yours, and then a small bio of sorts on Naipaul. I'm sure most or all of you will know about him, so there may not be any big surprises in what I'm going to say. And also a brief discussion about A House for Mr. Biswas before we get into reading the book. So Classically Yours was started, I want to say a year ago. And what we do is we pick one classic at a time, and invariably takes about a few weeks to read it. We try to pick up books that are maybe a challenge to being read alone. If you look at what we've read so far, there's War and Peace, Macbeth, The Metamorphosis, Midsummer Night's Dream, The Dead by Joyce, Don Quixote de Profundi, A Room of One's Own, Walden, and Decameron. And then on some fun nights, we had just poems and short stories. But like I said, the takeaway is that we try not to pick books that you may be able to read on your own, but you can consume privately. But rather books that probably benefit from being discussed in a group, and you just kind of, bounce off each other. And we meet every Monday, almost every Monday, around 7:45, 8 we start, and it goes till 9 o'clock. And the way this session would go is that at the end of today, I'll send out a message saying that let's try to finish by page, maybe 100 pages in a week, okay? I think that's only about 15 minutes of reading a day, or 20 minutes, which should be possible. We do have to be a little disciplined, because if we fall too far behind, then we lose the merit of everyone. Everyone will be as weak as the weakest link. So that we have to take care of. Okay. Okay, a little bit about Naipaul. I think everyone here should be familiar with him. He was born in Trinidad. He was an Indo-Trinidadian descendant. His grandfather came over from India, from Uttar Pradesh. And he lived in Trinidad. He was a very bright boy. He says that when he was very young, he wanted to become a writer, although he didn't have any he did not know of any writing skills he had. He just had the ambition to be a writer. And when he was 16, he applied for a scholarship, which I think the best student of the year of the school would get to go to study in any English university they wanted to. And Trinidad was a colony then under the British rule, and the dream was to escape from the margins of the world, as he called it, to the center, which was England. So when he was 17, he moved to England. I don't want to say he never came back to Trinidad. He came back to Trinidad to write a few books, and for his sister's funeral. But apart from that, he never came back to live there. He believed that what was behind him was done. So he had a very tough time in Oxford, although he felt that he was smarter than most of his fellow students and the teachers. He found that they were shallow. He didn't like the politics of academic life, and he got very depressed. At one point, he tried to commit suicide, but he kind of stumbled through. He didn't do well in Oxford. I think he failed for his master. It's not called masters, but he failed some exams. He lost any opportunity of being supported by the university if he wanted to do higher studies. He got married very young. Patricia Hale was his wife. They were both early 20s when they got married, and it was not a good marriage. It was, well, we'll get to that. He's as great a writer as he is, it's balanced by the fact that he's a pretty horrible human being in many ways. But so he started writing. He first started writing short stories, but they said there was no market for short stories about the Caribbean, because nobody had written books about the Caribbean in that way. So they didn't believe that these books would get any readership in the United Kingdom or the United States. So he came up with a novel called Miguel Street, which is it's a novel, but it's kind of not really a huge novel. It's full of sketches, and that got published. And then his first major novel was the one we're going to be reading, A House for Mr. Biswas. And he spent 2 or 3 years writing it. There's a very eloquent essay about how he felt when he wrote it, and how he felt when he listened to it being performed on the BBC many years later, and the toil it took. And as a writer, it kind of really affects you when you hear him talk about those things. So after Mr. Biswas, he he did a book about Trinidad, and then very famously, especially in India, or infamously, he wrote 3 books about India over 20 years time. In 1961, he came to India and he wrote The Area of Darkness. This was not well India. This was banned in India because he was very explicit about his descriptions of what he saw. Some parts of it were quite hysterical, but he was very strongly opinionated and he was very sharp. So you could observe things for what they were. And he had a kind of a mental, I don't want to say a breakdown, but his response to when he went to the UK from Trinidad, he thought it would be welcoming and it would be the place he meant to be. But that was not the case. But when he came to India, because his ancestors were from India, he kind of expected something like that. But instead, he found it very different. He could not abide by the filth, the casual approach to public defecation, which is very famous, and dust, and a lot of other things which really kind of grated him. So anyway, the book, he made friends. The book was well reviewed, but it was banned in India. Many people felt that it was anti-Indian. He went away. He started traveling all over the world doing books. He traveled to Africa famously quite a few times. And he made good friendships with a writer named Paul Theroux, who's written a terrific travel book called The Great Railway Bazaar. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead. The second book on India was called India, A Wound to Civilization. That was in 1979. He came to India during Indira Gandhi's emergency period. So in that book, he talks more about how India has been repeatedly ravaged by the Muslim conquerors, and how no country, he felt that no country had been so unprepared for future ravagement. After being attacked once, they never put up walls and never fortified themselves, but they kept letting conquerors come in and pillage and rape and assorted things. That was 78, 79. And then in 1988, he came to India. He felt that he saw something different. He was able to see more spirit in the people. This book came out just a few years before Manmohan Singh went to Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, when they opened up the privatization and everything, the industries were Indian local industries were modified because we had much more foreign income and investment. And I'm forgetting the word now. Sorry about that. But anyway, the books are, I wouldn't say A Wound to Civilization is any kinder than Area of Darkness, but they're probably progressively kinder. And after India, A Million Mutinies, now he came to India many times. And he had very strong opinions. He was a big follower. He was a big believer in Hindutva. He always had this pose that he was not political, but that the way he was political. And in by saying he was not political, that itself was kind of a political move, I would say, from his side. Yeah, liberalization. Yeah, I forget the word. Anyway, sorry. Okay, now why is he so highly rated? The writer versus the man, should that matter? Now, if I poll you guys and ask you about Naipaul, I'll get many different opinions. I think people accept that he's a great writer. Many people have not read too much of it. They've read more about him than they have read him. Has everyone read Naipaul in some form, or most of you have or have not?
I haven't.
Okay.
That's the short story.
Yeah.
I haven't read.
Same here. I haven't.
Okay. So one of the reasons that he's very highly rated is that he kind of had to reinvent a form. So when Naipaul wanted to become a writer, there was no really colonial literature with any sort of legs or strength. And he talks about when he first sat down to write a book, he could not access books by Evelyn Waugh and Anthony Powell and the British writers and Henry James and those guys, where the words they used and environments they lived in were kind of assumed to be known when you read a book. to the point where when I was a kid, and I'm sure it's true for most of you, that when you read English books, Enid Blyton or little older stuff, or Wuthering Heights or the Bronte sisters, they would talk about portions of the house, and I didn't even know what they meant. It'd be an attic, and there'd be a pantry, and I don't know, but I just read it, and you wouldn't ask those questions. But those are words that come from a very settled, very mature society in terms of has been around for a long time. So, and it's being read by an audience that automatically knows those words. But when you're writing about Trinidad, or when you're writing about a house in Kerala or something, you talk about a veranda, and you talk about a tree that's exotic or a tree that's unusual, and you have to use words. You have your teapoy and a fan. You're going into an area in your mind that's not been gone there. That you don't have any role models to look up to, basically, at least in prose. So he says, and I don't think it's too harsh and exact, but most of his books are, he had to find a way into the book. His travel books are not like a tourist guide, like this is where you go, that you go. It's more of kind of understanding the people who live in the country and forming an opinion about them. And there's some study that the average length of a word in his books is only 4 letters. This is very important because when you read him, you have the effect of, even after you read 3 pages, you feel like you've read a lot, because it's crammed. At the same time, it's not stuffed. I don't know if I'm making sense here. He uses the words very carefully. He's very he's got a vocabulary and all this stuff, but he tries not to show off in that way. He tries to pare it down to simple words. But that's the writing style. I think everybody, whatever your opinions about Naipaul are as a person, and his opinions about India, and many, I mean, he over the last 20 years of his life, he got into this annoying habit of, whenever he'd have a book coming out, he'd do interviews. And in his interviews, he'd always say something really provocative. I mean, nobody was good enough. He'd say Henry James was the worst writer in the world. The New Yorker magazine has published my work, but they don't know anything about writing. Jane Austen is completely fluff. I read her books. They're about some lady who wants to get married. I cannot get myself to be interested. And even more controversial lines, like the dot on an Indian woman's forehead means there's nothing in my head. So these are all the misogynistic, I don't say misanthropic, but misogynistic bias in terms of personal preferences. He has all sorts of biases. And he's definitely not a role model in that way. He came out, there was an authorized biography of him that came out in 2011, by 2010, Patrick French. So the most amazing thing about this biography is that it's a great book, first of all, it's terrific. The book is an authorized biography. When I'm sure all of you know, if it's an authorized biography, it means the writer has control over everything the biographer publishes. Like if there's something unflattering, if there's something negative about him, the writer has the right, the author has just can tell the subject can tell the writer of the biography, I don't want that in the book, take it out. But Naipaul, this is an interesting way to look at it. You can take it as an act of tremendous ego, or you can take it as an act of tremendous humility, where he gave Patrick French full access to his archives, all his books, everything, all the manuscripts, every letter, everything. He was a very assiduous letter writer. All of them were there. And most valuably, there were 30 years of mail correspondence between him and his wife. And he told Patrick French that he could use all of that anywhere. And a lot of it is not even in the least bit flattering to Naipaul. It's horrendous. And French says that he went through he attended a lot of interviews with Naipaul, and he got information from him. But when he read the final, the galleys of the book, he did not ask for one change. He felt he's got this weird honesty in him. Is that he felt that let them show what they show. My writing is good enough that people will still rate me. So of course, he won the Nobel in 2001. He won the Booker in 1971 for In a Free State. I think that's the only Booker. Yeah. No, we went through this already. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. Okay. So now this is when we come to a house from Mr. Biswas. Okay. One of the most amazing things, and this maybe we can appreciate this more after we read it, is that it was written in his late 20s, and it comes out as this almost fully formed, perfect novel. On the surface, it's about a man named Mohun Biswas. He's married to. He's not very happy with his wife, but more of he's not happy with his wife's family. His wife's family is very successful. He's not successful. He's not a great success in life. He's kind of middling. He works for a newspaper. He doesn't do great. He gets laid off at some point in the book, and he's always kind of not henpecked to a degree and kind of cowered by his wife's family, cowered by life. And his only ambition turns out to be that he wants a house for himself. He feels that if a man has a house, then he has a piece of land where he can reject anyone he wants, accept anyone he wants. He is the king in that land. A lot of the book is biographical, because Mohun Biswas is based on Naipaul's father, who was the biggest influence in his life, not from a writing point of view, but from a writing inspiration point of view. The desire to write, that came from his father. His father was Siprasad Naipaul. He died relatively young at 46. But his father was a struggling journalist who had a wife and 4 kids or 5 kids, and he could never get out from under the thumb of conventional life. So he wanted his son to have what he couldn't have in some way. And the son was sharp and cold-blooded and selfish enough to realize that he wanted that for himself. Naipaul never had kids because he told his wife that if they had kids, then it would take away from his writing, and he genuinely believed that. So if you look at it, the central themes of the book are alienation. He's alienated from his wife's family. He's alienated at work. He feels that if he has a possession like a house, then that will tie into his sense of identity, which I think is something most of us can understand, and a sense of ownership. The story is ostensibly about one man, and it's a microcosm of his journey. But in some way, if you step back and look at it from a 10,000 feet point of view, it's also about the struggle of the immigrant, or the struggle of anyone who doesn't really fit in, and how they kind of feel like they're cut out from the mainstream of society and what they go through. And none of this is explicitly said in the book. He's very much a show, don't tell kind of writer. Any questions?
Which genre of, which kind of period was it written in? No, I mean, what kind of a time period was it? Is it a post-colonial book, or is it something related? I'm asking in terms of the genre, in terms of the period and the genre.
Do you want to know what period the book covers? The book kind of covers.
Yeah.
Post-colonial.
The setting of the okay.
The setting is post-colonial. Yeah. Okay, these are, in my opinion, his best books. I've cheated and I put 3 in 1. But okay, In a Free State, the one that won the Booker, is a collection of 5 novellas, which are interlinked only by theme, like no other, nothing stronger than that. A Bend in the River is considered to be his masterpiece, along with Biswas, and it has his most famous line. He says, "The world is what it is. Men who are nothing, who allow themselves to become nothing, have no place in it." And that's a very stark, cold Napoleon sentiment, actually. And the one that's covered, I'm sorry, that's Enigma of Arrival, and that's the most. It's the most novel I've read, in terms of, it's really hard to classify whether it's fiction. There's so much autobiography in it, but at the same time, it is about a fictional character like him, and some parts of it are so beautiful. So, and then there's a book called Between Father and Son, which is a set of family letters, which talk about, he corresponded regularly with his father when he was in Oxford and his father was in Trinidad. And so and his sister, I think she got married and she moved to Benares, or she was studying in Benares. So it's got extracts from letters between the 3 of them, a little bit of his sister, but all his correspondence between him and his father. And they're very elaborate. They're very, you feel a great fondness for the father when you read those letters, because the father he wants nothing more than his son to realize his dream of writing. Not the father's dream, son's dream. he wants to do whatever he can to support him, but he's kind of constantly, knocked down by life. Probably that's not it wouldn't make much sense unless you've read a few of his other books and a bit about him. And then the 3 Indian books. Of these, I would say more than the third, the first 2 are better. Area of Darkness. The third to me felt a little bit padded. I think the publisher was going for a certain number of pages or words. But Wounded Civilization is, I think it's better than Area of Darkness. Okay, this is a couple of books about Naipaul. One is the biography I just told you about, the Patrick French bio, The World is What It Is. And the other one is a book called Sir Vidya's Shadow by Paul Theroux. Paul Theroux is this American writer who was teaching in Kenya in the 60s, mid to late 60s, when Naipaul went there on assignment. He went there as visiting lecturer. And they formed a friendship from then till the 90s, when they had a huge falling out because of his second wife. And but Theroux came out with this terrific biography. It's a lot of fun. It's very well written also, and it shows both sides of Naipaul: the acerbic, brilliant critic, his wit, his sharpness, and also his ugly side. And Naipaul did not want to have anything to do with the book. He kind of disavowed Paul Theroux for a long time, and they had a falling out, which many people have with him, as you can guess, until much later when they made up, because Theroux met him at a function, at a literary function in London, and he went forward and spoke to him, and all was forgiven, I guess. But that's what I have by way of a brief presentation. Any questions, anything you want to know? We're just gonna basically chew the fat and figure out how far we're going to read next week.
No, not a question, but
Please.
you say that it's an appreciation. You really covered Naipaul very well in your presentation. Now we have a good idea about. But I'd like to tell you that in our book club, we discussed Bend in the River.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was soon after he died. Or I don't know when we read it, 2-3 years back. 2 years back.
He died in 2018, so it would have been 2 years back, yeah.
Yeah. So around that time we read it in May 2018.
Okay.
So Bend in the River, as you say, is a wonderful book. And the language, and the same day when we were discussing,
Mm-hmm.
the organizer of that place, Raha, had organized one PowerPoint from a gentleman, now I forget his name, about Naipaul.
Okay.
Naipaul's relationship with India.
Okay.
And in which he had covered all these points which you just mentioned, how his comments about India were very, and then why his books were, obviously he ended up banned in India. And
I think only the first book was banned. But the second book, I don't know, it came out during the emergency, so maybe everything was banned at that time. But the first book was banned.
Slowly he started writing a little better about India, but initially his comments were really annoying for Indians. But he had really quoted those, like you gave the presentation just now, and that time. So that's what I wanted to add to your presentation. That
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, we had a session on Naipaul as well, where there was I chose to stay away from the nasty stuff he said about. I found some examples of his writing which I love greatly, and as an aspiring writer, I keep going back to his writing. It's so tight. I mean, and I would like to share something now. I mean, there's a foreword to Mr Biswas, which I don't know if it's there in the new book, but hold on, let me just share that screen, okay?
Yeah.
Please, I don't want you to feel that I'm hogging the mic, although I am hogging the mic. Please, if anybody has anything you want to say, please feel free to talk. This was a foreword that he wrote after, what was it, 20 years after the book came out, I think. And this is what he says: of all my books, this is the one that is closest to me. It is the most personal, created out of what I saw and felt as a child. It also contains, I believe, some of my funniest writing. I began as a comic writer and still consider myself one. In middle age now, I have no higher literary ambition than to write a piece of comedy that might complement or match this early book. The book took 3 years to write. It felt like a career. And there was a short period towards the end of the writing when I do believe I knew all or much of the book by heart. The labor ended. The book began to recede. And I found that I was unwilling to re-enter the world I had created, unwilling to expose myself again to the emotions that lay below the comedy. I became nervous of the book. I haven't read it since I passed the proofs in May 1961. So my first direct contact with the book since the proofreading came 2 years ago in 1981. I was in Cyprus in the house of a friend. Late one evening, the radio was turned on to the BBC World Service. I was expecting a news bulletin. Instead, an installment of my book was announced. The previous year, the book had been serialized on the BBC in England as a book at bedtime. This serialization was now being repeated. I listened, and in no time, though the installment was comic, though the book had inevitably been much abridged, and the linking words were not always mine, I was in tears, swamped by the emotions I had tried to shield myself from for 20 years. Lakmeriram, the tears of things, tears in things, to the feeling of the things written about, the passions and nerves of my early life. There was added a feeling for the time of the writing, the ambition, the tenacity, the innocence. My literary ambition had grown out of my early life. The two were intertwined. The tears were for a double innocence. So he talks about the ambition was given to me by my father in Trinidad when nearly everyone was poor and most people were uneducated. He had made himself a journalist. At a certain stage, not for money or fame, but out of some private need, he had begun to write short stories. Not formally educated, a nibbler of books rather than a reader, my father worshipped writers and writing. He made the vocation of the writer seem the noblest thing in the world, and I decided to be that noble thing. So he talks about getting the scholarship, moving away to England in 1950 when he was 17. My childhood dream of writing had been a dream of fame and escape and an imagined elegant style of life. Nothing in my father's example or conversation had prepared me for the difficulties of narrative prose, of finding a voice, the difficulties of going on to the next book and the next, the searching of oneself for matter to write about. But equally, nothing had prepared me for the liberation and absorption of this extended literary labor, the joy of allowing fantasy to play on stored experience, the joy of the comedy that so naturally offered itself, the joy of language. The right words seemed to dance above my head. I plucked them down at will. I took chances with language. Before this, out of my beginner's caution, I had been strict with myself. In the last year, mental and physical fatigue touched me. I had never before experienced that depth of fatigue. I became aware of how much I had given to the book, and I thought that I could never be adequately rewarded for the labor. And I believe it is true to say that the labor had burnt up thoughts of reward. Often, out in the Streatham Hill streets, momentarily away from the book, shopping perhaps, I thought, if someone were to offer me £1 million on condition that I leave the book unfinished, I would turn the money down. Though I didn't really need one, I bought a new typewriter to type out the precious finished manuscript. But I was too tired to type to the end. That had to be done professionally. When the book was handed in, I went abroad for 7 months. An opportunity for travel in the Caribbean and South America had been given me by the Trinidad government. Colonial Trinidad had sent me to Oxford in 1950, and I had made myself a writer. Self-governing Trinidad sent me on a colonial tour in 1960, and by this accident, I became a traveler. It wasn't absolutely the end of the Streatham Hill house. I was to go back there for 9 months to write a book about my travels. But that was another kind of writing, another skill. It could be as taxing as fiction. It demanded in some ways an equivalent completeness of man and writer, but it engaged another part of the brain. No play of fantasy was required. The writer would never regard with wonder what he had drawn out of himself, the unsuspected truths turned up by the imagination. The 2 years spent on this novel in Streatham Hill remain the most consuming, the most fulfilled, the happiest years of my life. They were my Eden. Hence, more than 20 years later, the tears in Cyprus. To me, that when he talks about the sense of joy he had when he wrote the book, I think that comes through in the book. The book is very funny in a very honest way, in terms of without being forced comic scenarios. People we can all relate to on some level or the other, even though it's way in Trinidad. It's a specific microcosm of that society, but it's a very universal story at the same time.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
It's a trivia. A niece of mine, she lives in Canada. She was born in Canada. She has married a West Indian, originally from India. They just got a child, and they've named him Mohun.
Okay.
So I asked him, why Mohun? Because
Mohun
Mohun
Biswas.
is an old-fashioned name. So I said, is his ancestor, somebody in his family named Mohun? She said, no, but his favorite book is a house of Mr Biswas. And that's why he has named the child Mohun. Isn't it great?
It's beautiful. I think it's
beautiful. Even my favorite book is, of all the books of Naipaul, my favorite is House of Mr Biswas. I read it long ago, but it's my favorite.
I think it's the one I love the most, but my favorite has to be Enigma of Arrival. I think it was staggering. Yeah. Oh wow, that's quite a nice little honor for Naipaul. Not that he would have been nice to your nephew. You told him that he was very famously nasty. He was.
Yeah.
When he was married, he used to frequent prostitutes, and his wife found out because there was a magazine article in which he confessed to it. And she read the magazine article and found out, which is horrible, I guess. And he said such crushing things to her. He said, you don't behave like the wife of a writer. You are behaving beneath my station. You don't deserve to be. There's no possible excuse for his behavior. And in 71 or 72, he went to Argentina to write what would become he wrote an essay about Eva Peron, and he became a book called The Return of Eva Peron. But there he met a lady, and he fell in kind of, I don't know, he had an affair with her, if you can call 20 years an affair. But that relationship was also extremely unhealthy. He was very violent to her. He would beat her and slap her. And in his own letters, he said, I beat her so hard that she has red marks on her face. She can't show her face for 3 days. And he would say it unapologetically in some way, but not bragging, but not apologetic either. And so he was with her for 18 years, and his wife knew about it. And she was very timid and very docile, and she worshipped the ground that Vidya walked on. And she was still proofreading his books and editing him and being the first reader while he was having this affair. And she knew about the affair. It was this weird menage a trois of sorts. And in the end, he broke it off with her and married his wife, the woman who was his wife when he died, Nadira, the Pakistani lady. And there's a lot of repulsive, obnoxious views. And funny views too sometimes. He says that I read in an English magazine that someone compared me to George Orwell. That comparison does not do any credit to my writing. He really respected no one, literally no one. I mean, he rated his father very highly, but that's it, I think. And not only, I don't know if he rated his father's writing, but I think his father's ambition he rated. But I don't think he rated any writer except for maybe Shakespeare and the absolute ancient ones. But the biography and the Thoreau book have a lot of interesting anecdotes about him. He came to Uganda as a visiting professor. He was supposed to be, he was called a writer in residence. That's what the title is. So typically you come, you stay with the university for a semester or 2 semesters. You conduct 2 classes a week or something like that. You give people advice on writing. But he came, he accepted the offer. He came down, and the first day they met him and they asked him, so when do you want to conduct your classes? And he says, I'm not teaching anything. And they said, what do you mean? He says, no, I don't want to teach. He says, why are you here? He says, you called me to be a writer in residence. That's exactly what I'm going to be. I'll be a writer in residence, but I won't do anything else. And they kind of had to twist, they kind of had to bend over backwards. He was being mischievous, of course. I mean, he knew what it entailed, but he felt that all of it was beneath him some way. They asked him to judge a short story contest or writing contest of sorts. And he came up on stage and said, I've read all the entries, and none of this is good enough for first prize. I can only give third prize, which is just, being mischievous in a way.
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to say it's very remarkable that he got a scholarship, like, being uneducated, and then getting a scholarship to London and like wherever foreign, to like at the age of 17,
But Trinidad was a Commonwealth. It was not common. It was under British rule back then.
Yeah.
So the schools had a program where the top students, I think the top 5 students in all of Trinidad, the top 6 students, whatever, they could all get a scholarship. And he was very bright, obviously. I mean, and so the brightest students got that chance to study anywhere they wanted in the UK. So he chose Oxford. Oxford to him symbolized the place, because he went to Oxford and he hated it. That's a different thing. But you don't know at that time, right?
No, she meant that he being uneducated and he got a scholarship. I don't think that's correct.
He wasn't uneducated at all. Why do you think
she said that. Said that. She got that
He
impression.
wasn't uneducated at all. He had a proper education. Why did you think he was uneducated?
Said he did not have proper education like that. I don't.
No, he had proper education. 6th form, 7th form, all over. Yeah. His father gave him the love of books and writers, but his schooling was fine. I think it was like typical normal schooling, like all of us had. So, yeah, if he had gotten a scholarship being uneducated, that would have been really remarkable, I think.
Yeah.
No, I think, Shankar, did you say something about his father? He became a journalist, though his family was uneducated. Maybe from there maybe that confused her. I don't know.
No, his father was uneducated. His father became a journalist from modest beginnings, I would say.
Yeah.
I missed like I thought like you had like I thought that because of modesty you mentioned, I thought the other thing that might be possible.
No, this is what I read. I read that the ambition was given to me by my father in Trinidad, a small agricultural colony where nearly everyone was poor and most people were uneducated. He had made himself into a journalist. I don't think even his father. His father was also educated. I think they were Brahmins. They were from a different sect. They were not Trinidadian.
Can you mention that most of the people are uneducated? That's why I began to generalize.
Yeah, you jumped on that. Yeah, that's fine. No problem. No.
His brother also was a writer.
Shiva Naipaul, yeah, but
Shiva Naipaul.
Yeah. And
he died too early.
He died very young.
He died too young.
He talks about that. He said that when Naipaul was in London, his father died. He was 20, and so traditionally the elder son has to go back to do the rituals and the rites. But back then it would have taken forever to go back, so he couldn't do it. His brother did it, and he was 7 or 8 years old when he had to do the final rites for his father. And Naipaul's rites, Naipaul WRIT, is that Shiva was forever scarred by the weight of death. That's his take on it. But I think he was a talented writer too, but he was not as disciplined as Vidya, and he had a problem. He used to drink too much. I think he had issues like that.
I had a question about Trinidad because I know very little about Trinidad. Trinidad has a sizable Indian population, I presume. And what do they do mostly? I mean, are they educated? Are they uneducated? Are they menial workers?
You mean now?
I mean, back when he was born and when he
Well,
when
he
he was
was
growing
born
up?
in Trinidad, but his grandfather was one of those indentured laborers who moved from UP to Trinidad. And that has colored Naipaul's view of why the colonial masters, for them, the only reason the West Indies existed was so that they could bring in cheap labor, make them work on the plantations and make money of them. They never really treated them as people, which is why he came up with some very harsh things about West Indian society, saying that they were half-made societies, and there's no, if you go around West Indian, when Trinidad and the other countries, you will never see any memorials to West Indians because there's no achievement there. That's what he says. Achievement can only come from a sense of pride. Achievement can only come from a sense of building something. But these people were barely allowed to exist. You don't have their names in half the records. So he wrote a book called The Loss of El Dorado, which kind of really, it's a good retelling of Walter Raleigh and the story. There was a story that was told in Trinidad about how Walter Raleigh, brought so many good things to the Caribbean. And then Naipaul did some further digging by going into libraries, and he found out the maybe the more obvious, now maybe obvious, back then, the ulterior motives of these colonizers, why they came to these islands and why they worked on these, let these people work, not worked on. So yeah, so they were indentured laborers, and the way it works is you worked on the land, and after, if you did enough time, and if you paid off or something like that, you could buy your freedom, or you could buy a small square of land or something like that. But it was not easy. I think his grandfather was a priest, and so they had some kind of respect a little bit, because they would call for all functions and this kind of stuff. So, yeah. So once his book started coming out, a lot of people in the colonies, to use maybe a relative, but like India and those countries, found that it was legitimate to have a voice to talk about these things. You did not have to write in the style of, say, an English writer. You could really, and I can't overstate this, but the power of the pioneer should never be underestimated. To look at something that is not there and then say, I'm going to do it. And then you think about that and you apply the fact that he wrote this book when he was 27 or 28, the confidence he had, it's so depressing. But he was so fully realized. And if you read the book about his letters to his father, even they are wonderful in terms of the way he writes. But yeah, so by doing that, he gave that a voice, he gave that legitimacy. I don't want to say, I'm not saying he did it for that, but he was such an honest writer in terms of, he never wanted to write something that was already written. He never wanted to repeat what was already written. So he talks about, in many places, he talks about the struggle that he had to find his material and find out what he wanted to communicate. It's not just about a man who wants a house. That's not the story. That's the framing device, you can call it that. But why does he want to tell the story? That's what he is an immigrant. He's been bound. He is twice removed. He thinks of himself, he's an Indian who moved to Trinidad. From Trinidad, he moved to the UK. So he's twice exiled in some way. And then when he came back to India, he didn't fit in the way he expected to fit in. And so all of that rawness, and he was extremely a very hysterical person as it is. There's an anecdote in the book where they have this repairman who's come to the house to fix something in the closet or something, and there's some guy, and the guy's talking to his wife or whatever, and the guy's fixing, and then while he's talking to the wife and him, the guy sits on their bed, and then he finishes talking and he goes out, and Naipaul is almost crying. He's telling his wife, he sat on our bed. He put his bum on our bed. He can't, it's such, in that way, he's like when he goes to not restaurants, but when he goes to dinner parties, he's very finicky about what he eats. He can't have a plate which has, he doesn't want a dish where there's non-veg also served. He eats fish, but whatever his rules, everything. He's very finicky that way. So that Brahminical code is there in him, but he decides what falls and where. If you read him and you read his interviews, he's very dismissive of interviewers as well. I know when he came to India 15 years ago, these two girls from Bangalore went to Bombay to meet him, and they're like aspiring journalists. And I knew one of them was a friend of mine. So she told me they took a train. They were like, they had read a few of his books. They were all gung ho by the energy of youth. Like, we're going to meet Naipaul. And they went and they said, we went up to his room. They knocked on the door. You opened the door and he says, who are you? He says, we've come from Bangalore, la 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 la. And he says, you know nothing about my books. Look at you. And he asked them like 2 questions. He asked them 2 questions, and based on their answers, he was very dismissive. And he asked them to go away, and they couldn't believe it. Utterly gutted. But then people they knew told them, you should never have come up here expecting him to be nice to you. I mean, he's dismissive of the sharpest intellects. The part of it is ego, but part of it is also, more often than not, he's the smartest guy in the room in some ways. I had a weird experience reading the biography because I knew nothing. I mean, when you read the travel books, they don't mention anything about a wife or a fiance. He doesn't talk about Pat. I mean, he talks about his companion in a few places, but there's no idea that he has this rich, well, not rich, he has this huge sexual appetites, and that he has a companion with him everywhere. Then you read the book and you find out that he's this horrendous person. It really, and you want to like the writers you like. I mean, on some level, I mean, it's just it's an instinctive thing. You really have to come to terms with it when you read the book. There were parts where I had to just put the book down and ponder. I mean, I give him credit for letting the book be published as is. That's the ego and the humility both intertwined. This is me. Just you're going to take me or leave me. When he won the Nobel, he said, I have nothing of interest to say. Everything that I have to say, I've said in my books. I am just the sum of my books. And he raised an interesting point about whether you should judge a writer only based on his books or also the books and the man. Because Proust, there was a French critic called Saint-Beuve who wrote a book saying that to know a writer, you have to know his books, to know a writer, you have to know his life, you have to know all this. And Proust came out with this very famous essay called Against Saint-Beuve. So he said that he argued, and Naipaul falls on the side of Proust, saying that if you want to know a writer, just read his books. Everything else is extraneous. And he really proved it, because the rest of his life is so horrendous that you don't want to know anything about it. But it's a point of view, and I don't know if it works in today's media thing. But when I think of people like Ferrante, I think that's very true, right? In the end, what really compels us about the writer has to be the writing. It cannot be the other way around. So I've asked everybody, but the people who joined late, Rujuta, Akshinta, Bhagyashi, Pallavi, and Sheetal. Do you guys have the book already, or are you going to get it?
I'm going to get it.
We have a PDF. If you
Yeah,
want.
PDF. Okay.
No. I've got it. I can send it to you.
Okay, I have the PDF. I'm good. Okay, yeah. I shared the PDF on the WhatsApp group, so people have that.
Okay.
No, I just want to know if someone's planning to buy the physical book and we have to wait to start for like coming up with how far we want to get into the book. That's all I'm asking. I think we can start tomorrow or tonight, and so part 1 has 294 pages. So I think we can do the first 3 chapters: pastoral, before the Tulsis, and the Tulsis. So that will take us to page 134. Is that okay?
Shankar, I think we'll keep a shorter one, smaller target, because if someone wants to buy the paperback.
Okay, so we'll get the first 2 then: pastoral and before the Tulsis.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's 76 pages. His first wife, Patricia, after she died, she had cancer and she died, and he distributed ashes on Stonehenge and all that. And he told, I don't know if he told Patrick French, he said, honestly, he said that she and I were incompatible, and she died. Part of her illness was because of me. And he said, and I remember this phrase, he says, it could be said that I killed her. And he meant it without, I like to think he meant it without, he was being matter of factly, because when you look at the letters, he's very harsh about himself as well, and I think he accepted that the marriage was a disaster, and he took huge advantage of her. the fact that she was so timid. So she didn't have the strength to walk out of the marriage. And yeah, but when I read that line, it kind of gave me a chill. Once it could be said that I killed her. And then, of course, he goes and 2 days after her funeral, he moved into the house with his new wife. So that's also him. So, yeah. Okay, so we'll do the first 2 chapters of part 1. Saga? Pastoral and before the Tulsis. The Tulsis are the name of his wife's families. He hates them. So I just remember that there was a late dedication to his wife in the, I guess, I don't know which edition this is, but it says, for this book written between 1957 and 1960, a late dedication, PAN, that's Patricia Ann Naipaul, 31 July 1932 to 3rd February 1996. So belatedly, he dedicated the book to her. Which for someone like me, like, she's dead. What's the point now? But I guess she's doing something. The Complicated Man. No 2 ways about it. But a lot to learn from if you just want to look at the writing and how he approached the writing. Even how he talks about the writing, it's very pure and clean. And I mean, those of you who are not writers may not get that into about it, but that's also an interesting thing for me. Can anyone turn on the cameras? We'll take a photograph. I don't think we've ever had this many people for classical years, so let's do it. Sumit, Bhagyashree, Pallavi, Sheetal.
Sheetal, Bhagyashree.
Bhagyashree, I think nice. Just 1 second.
Ah, there we are. Sumit, another picture. Bhagyashree is here.
Yeah, that Shankar number.
Oh, Shankar is not here now. So we have a, yeah.
Ready? Shankar.
Is it done?
Yeah.
Okay. So we will be posting updates on the WhatsApp group. Is everyone on this group on the classical years WhatsApp group?
I'm writing my number here.
Manjuri.
I'm not.
Please ping me and I'll add you to the WhatsApp group.
Can you all think Sumit and he'll add you? Add them to PWG or the other one, whichever was. The other
on
one has
classical
bandwidth.
yours. On classical
Classical years has more bandwidth, yeah.
Dipankar, just ping me.
Yeah, I pinged you. Yeah.
Hey, on WhatsApp, ping me on WhatsApp. I've given my number there.
Oh, all right, sure.
I won't know who. I'll add you to classical years because we don't post updates of the upcoming sessions on Facebook and Meetup.
Yeah.
So
correct. We only post for the new session and then we just kind of follow it, run with the ball.
Pankaj, you also ping me. I've given my number there in the chat.
Yeah, sure. I'll do that.
Yeah.
All right.
Tara and Manjari, if you want to.
Yeah, I put my number there. I couldn't just put my number on the chat.
Okay. So Sumit, you opened the session, right?
Sorry?
You're the one who opened the session today, right?
Yeah.
I joined after. So you'll get the chat. So you'll have all the numbers.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Good. I was talking to someone earlier today and I told them that I'm choosing this book. And they were very surprised because I've read this book a few times and they're like, why are you going for a book you've read? And I said,
how do I give my number?
There's a button called chat at the bottom with a speech bubble. Can you see it?
In the center.
Actually, if you're going to put it on there, you might as well say the number and somebody can just write it down also. Yeah. Just tell us what your number is. Oops.
The session is officially over.
Yeah, we're not recording this part, so